Hello, and welcome to The Mind of a Therapist, a podcast where I interview psychotherapists and helping professionals on what they're passionate about in order to provide you with messages of encouragement and hope. I'm your host, Andrew Earl. The Mind of a Therapist is sponsored by Psychological Counseling Services, healing hearts and transforming lives. Look into our intensive at pcsintensive.com. In today's interview, I interview Kristen Burge. Kristen's a certified internal family systems, IFS for short, practitioner with the IFS Institute, with nearly 400 hours of IFS training in levels 1, 2, and 3, and IFS couples and relational work, known as intimacy from the inside out, IFIO. She has served as a program assistant for IFS Institute Level 1 and 2 trainings, is on staff for IFIO trainings, and has received a certification in clinical application of IFS therapy from the Adler Graduate Professional School. Kristen also incorporates somatic and group work in her practice and has participated in an IFS Healing Circles workshop, Somatic IFS retreats, and is currently training in Somatic Experiencing. Additionally, Kristen is licensed to practice as an attorney and certified mediator with Arrow Creek Law and Mediation, providing services in the area of Indian tribal government law, tribal employment law, mediation, and alternative dispute resolution. Kristen's passionate about the profound healing that is possible with the IFS model for individuals as well as groups and communities. She appreciates its respectful and collaborative approach, including integration of legacy and cultural aspects, which we'll talk about today, which are particularly important in working with indigenous communities. She's inspired by the tremendous potential of IFS and IFIO for mediation, conflict resolution, and relationship building in light of the deepening polarizations that we see in our society, and she remains hopeful in working towards a shift from adversarial paradigm to one of collaboration and respect for all peoples. So without further ado, here's my interview with Kristen. Kristen, welcome to the Mind of a Therapist podcast. Thanks for taking the time to join me today. And we're going to be talking about legacy burdens. I'm excited to learn more from you because I know you've studied legacy burdens a bit. Before we get to legacy burdens, I'm interested in hearing your take on change. What's your perspective on how people change, how systems change? We'll start there.
Thanks, Andrew. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. And wow, those are big questions and something I'm
it's a big question.
Yeah. Yeah. And it feels really near and dear to my heart as well too, because as someone who's worked in the legal profession and done work in mediation and now in IFS, those are all about different systems, and I'm looking at the larger system whenever I'm doing my own individual work or working with folks either on an individual level or in mediation, couples work. And so, my experience has been it really starts with me. So in the work that I do, those ripple effects that really can have an impact. And even in places like I did a continuing legal education offering on attorney wellness using IFS concepts, and just curious to see how that resonated with folks, and if that's something that can be helpful for systemic change, and maybe even looking at the justice system differently and restorative justice and how we resolve conflict in different situations. So, yeah, okay, that's a long-winded answer, but I think it starts with me, and then, try to join other folks who also feel, passion in different areas, and then together we can hopefully make some impacts in these systems
Yeah.
to make it better.
Yeah. Well, it is a big question, like we said, and so it's it makes sense to be a long answer, and that really resonates. If like it starts with us, the change in our internal system. I know in internal family systems we have this idea of the capital S self and the self taking leadership in our internal system to allow for healing, for unburdening, and then from that place we can step into these systems, the legal system, couple systems, and from that place of calm, creativity, courage, connectedness, support other people in changing and other systems in changing.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah. And I'd be curious to hear a bit about how you got interested in internal family systems, and then what drew you to learn more about legacy burdens and study that.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So back in 2018, I ended up going to a workshop that Dick Schwartz was doing at Multiversity 1440 near Santa Cruz, California. It's a week-long workshop. Not all therapists, like just, some therapists, some other folks who were just interested in IFS. And IFS was becoming more popular, but it hadn't exploded like the way it has, in the last few years. And some of those experiential activities, I've never had an experience of meeting or getting to know different parts of myself. So all that parts language, differentiating that and feeling some of this thing they call self energy. Was such an impactful experience for me that even though, I was like, oh, I'm doing this for work. I'm a mediator. It's be really helpful in mediation. I also felt a very personal draw to doing this work, and I applied to do a level 1 training. I did actually another IFS workshop, an IFS and mediation workshop, and then started level 1 training in 2019, shortly before the pandemic, so I was able to do it in person. And Ironically, like talking about legacy burdens in that training, they didn't talk about legacy burdens in a level 1 at that time. But in my last practice group, I was in the client role. And we do this practice where someone's in the therapist role and there's an observer. And I didn't really quite know what part I wanted to work on or be with. And it ended up being a legacy unburdening for me. And there just happened to be a very skilled PA or program assistant who was facilitating or helping with that practice group, who helped the therapist, go through that process. And it really blew my mind. I wasn't thinking about things that go beyond my system, things that were passed down my family line. But it really opened up a lot of healing for me, and I think for I guess, I don't know if to call them ancestors or from my lineage.
Yeah. Wow. And I think that that's a great place to segue into talking about what a legacy burden is. Maybe you could start by talking about what a burden is in IFS, and then how a legacy burden's different from a burden.
Sure. So I guess I notice that a part of me is like, oh, I don't have my sheets in front of me to make sure I say this exactly right. But I'll give kind of a general sense or idea of a burden when we think about that in an IFS lens or using IFS language. Burdens can be taken on by different parts of our system. So it's not only these real tender, young, vulnerable parts that are referred to as exiles, these ones that are kept tucked away that may have burdens, but also it can be protective parts of our system that can carry burdens as well. But essentially, in a nutshell, and I may be oversimplifying a bit, but burdens are things that parts of us take on based on experiences we've had, like beliefs for sometimes for exiled parts, that we're unworthy or unlovable or that there's something wrong with us. And those happen. I mean, I don't think I've not met anyone who hasn't had a burden, because we all have these experiences through life where, we try to make sense of things, and often young parts of us or when we're younger take on these beliefs, and we find ways of coping and managing with these protective parts to deal with that, and it's often to exile those ones. So
Sure.
they carry these burdens with them. So that's sort of the developmental, like in our own system, these burdens. But there also can be other burdens like that from living in the dominant culture, and then also things that may be passed down through our families, or legacy burdens. So sometimes if we feel like, it's just always been this way, I've always felt like I have to try 110%. I'm not sure where that came from. There could be things that happened when I was younger, but also it's like, yeah, no, my mom's like that, my grandma's like that. Like everyone I can remember my family, there was like this unspoken rule of you must go the extra mile or whatever that is. And
Sure.
that could be a legacy burden, for example.
Uh, so the burdens are these beliefs, sometimes extreme, that both exiles, like the little inner children inside of us, experience, but also the protective parts have as well. And those come from like direct experiences we have, painful experiences, but also you're saying cultural um, experiences we have, and then the legacy burdens are different in that they're definitely passed down from family, maybe a community group we're a part of, passed down societally, and so it's not something we necessarily have to have experienced. Is that, am I on track with that?
Yeah, so it's not something we necessarily get from our direct experience, although, it can be. Like it can be kind of like part legacy burden, part of our direct experience. But oftentimes, when you hear things like it's always been there, or, when you say like, well, when did this start? When did you feel like you had to start, you know, doing this to different parts of our system? And they're like, as long as I can remember. Things like that where that might be, an indication, not necessarily, but an indication that it could be a legacy burden.
Okay, yeah, they've always felt this way, believed this. Could you give a few examples you've seen of legacy burdens? Like I'm sure there's a lot of diversity in how they show up for people, but are there some common threads or specific examples you could share?
Yeah, so I don't know if there are common examples. I know from my own experience what the legacy burden was that I worked with. I also want to just have a slight little caveat that a lot of this work in the IFS community way has been developed by Ann Cinco, who's a senior lead trainer for IFS, and Kay Gardner also does work with legacy burdens, and she's also a senior lead trainer. And so there's a lot of folks who know way, way more about this than I do. I just want to put that out there. And I also want to bring in too that there are some newer trainers, Tamala Floyd, who's also, I believe, doing work around legacy burdens and bringing in an additional perspective on how legacy burdens are worked with. Because for some communities, it's not necessarily this linear passing it back through this one line, but
Mm-hmm.
it's more of an invitation to our ancestors to come in community, to have them help the well ancestors to help release this burden in the way that the person's system, feels like it would be best handled. So I just want to put that out there. There's not one particular way of doing it, but I know when I worked with that one in the level one training, it was something that actually went back to this harshness in my system around, like being strong, and you must, have to really be harsh, like sounds like an inner critic of sorts. But it went back to a legacy burden of people in my mother's line of the family who had to withstand some really horrific experiences back when the Philippines was colonized in order to survive. So there was this like harshness that's passed on, like, in order to be strong, it's like this really I don't know. There's a quality to it that I was picking up when I was doing this legacy unburdening, that I was able to see the positive intent of my ancestors of why, like, just being so harsh meant survival, right? And that was something that had never made sense to me before. And once I was able to see that and unburden it, it's something that I don't have to carry forward as well
Uh,
for my daughter, and
mm,
for her descendants, I hope. So it felt really important to me, but that was just one example of something that was a legacy burden, in my line.
Yeah. Well, and thank you for sharing that. And it sounds like in this moment, in recognizing the legacy burden and that harshness that you maybe saw in your mom, and maybe in a part of you, you were able to have more compassion and understanding for that, why that burden developed. It was a survival strategy for your ancestors.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It was, yeah, something that was really needed.
Yeah.
It's like we're not gonna deal with any, extraneous things like we have this, we need to take care of what we need to take care of, right? And so, yeah, it made a whole lot more sense to me. And I had a whole lot more compassion in my system, because having that understanding, it really helped, yeah, soften some parts that were really impacted by that growing up.
Hmm. And was there something that that facilitator who you were with did that kind of helped you to connect with that part and understand that it was a legacy burden?
Yeah, well, like I said, I didn't even hear the word legacy burden. I didn't know anything about it,
Yeah.
whenever we went in the practice group, and so when we started the session and they said, "Well, what do you wanna work with?" I'm like, I don't know, I'm noticing this swirling that's happening in front of me. It looks kinda like a tornado, and I see my mom's face and my daughter's face kind of floating around in this swirling. I didn't know what that meant, but, the PA had an inkling it might be a legacy burden by that, and then when the person in the practicing role asked some questions, this big curtain came down. It's like a dark gray curtain just came down, just shut the whole thing down.
Oh.
I was like, "Okay, well, I can't see anything anymore. I don't know what happened there." And, the PA who happened to be Bob Falconer, and he's written, like, a book on unattached burdens, and he's very well-versed with legacy burdens and this type of work.
Mm,
He was very comfortable and knowledgeable about this, and
mm,
and he was able to provide support and was just like, "Oh, well, welcome that curtain that came," "We see that, appreciate it." And feeling his confidence
mm.
really and support, as soon as he said what he said, that curtain just dropped. And
Oh.
then like seeing things, I mean, it sounds kind of woo. I personally like, "Oh, I can't believe you're saying this."
Yeah.
But I was seeing things that I couldn't have seen in my lifetime. This was
Mm,
many, 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 many years ago, many generations ago, of like colonization happening.
yeah.
And so, yeah, and then, just staying with that process of guiding, and allowing the burdens and what needs to be witnessed and then released, in a way that felt right for me and my ancestors, and it's providing a lot of space for it too.
Yeah.
Because I was, yeah, it was a really, kind of just mind-blowing experience. I had never experienced anything like that, and didn't even know something like that was possible.
Yeah. And so it was the confidence and just like clarity on where to go that the facilitator had. You felt safe, and he was accepting of
Mhm.
that curtain part that was kind of blocking you initially, and that just enabled that to drop, and then you
Yeah.
were able to step into um, connecting and learning about experiences your ancestors had. At that point, had
Mm.
you heard from your mom or learned somewhere about that history of trauma?
No, I hadn't. That's
Oh,
that's what why it's just so kind of
yeah.
surprising to my system, and really coming back to your question, it was really that feeling of from the PA that, like, whatever happens is okay, and
Mm,
I can handle it. Like, whatever happens, I can hold this, and it's gonna be okay. Like, it was really that feeling that allowed my system to go where it needed to go. Because I don't think if, if I didn't feel that, that curtain just would have stayed there, and then I've been like getting curious about the curtain, but
Yeah.
something in my system really trusted that it felt safe and that it was okay.
Mm. Well, and that kind of circles back to what you were talking about at the onset of the interview about how it starts with us, change, us helping others change starts with that, connection and confidence in our own internal world, and having that self energy is just so contagious.
Yeah. Yeah, self energy is it's really key, and I think it comes with really like practice and experience. Noticing those subtle shifts in, when I notice parts coming in, if I can feel it in my body, like the leaning forward, the clenching, it's like some
Yeah.
of these things that I'm like, oh yeah, there's this part of me that really wants to help, or
Yeah.
wants to figure it out. And that really helps me just get a little more space so I can be present for whatever arises.
Wow. That was really helpful to me. You talking there. I was even tuning into my own protectors that are up right now. One that lives in my shoulders. That's kind of like, okay, just, you know, get small, withdraw. don't don't be as present as and that is so true, isn't it? Like and that's what's so impactful for me with IFS is it's not about like getting rid of these parts, right? Or like really increasing positive self-talk, and trying to avoid negatives or whatever, try to avoid whatever beliefs and feelings these parts are burdened with, but just noticing them, and building that relationship and trusting relationship with them is so powerful.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I totally agree. And sometimes there's a misconception, I think, in doing this work that we try to get to the exile, like just get the parts out of the way and get to the exile. And I really feel like the so much of the work is befriending these parts of our system who that's who we are. They're beautiful, they're wonderful, they have gifts, they have wisdom. And when they felt really heard and appreciated, that's where I've noticed the biggest shifts in my system. I mean, yes, it definitely is life changing to have some exile work done and unburdening those tender, vulnerable ones. But like day to day life, like getting to know the person that want to be a perfectionist or the caretaking parts, all these ones that, have really good intentions has made such a difference for me. And one thing it reminds me of is I love this analogy, but it reminds me of like it feels like when like a kindergartner or something, like a little kid pulling on your shirt, like listen to me, listen to me, listen to me, and the more I don't listen, the louder this one gets. And so even though it's like, really, do we have to spend time and get to know these parts? The more we listen, the more they really soften, and it like there is just such I can't even describe it, but there's such a feeling of self-care and self-love when I listen to the parts that are needing my attention, the parts that are showing up and letting me know something.
Yeah. You're just speaking the truth there, Kristen. With my lived experience too, that taking the it's so counterintuitive to lean in and listen to these parts that we're often so frustrated with. It's like these parts that are addicted to things, these parts that get us in relational trouble, that embarrass us in front of others. Like, why would I listen to you? You're causing trouble in my life. And that's that. I think getting into that concept of polarization, that's another
Mhm.
part that's frustrating. And then they just kind of go back and forth. Um, and so, yeah, the power of listening and really tuning into the body, for you and me both, that's just been so powerful. And um, I'd be curious to hear more about we talked a bit about that, the legacy burdens. Is there? I want to get into the unburdening process a bit, but before we do that, is there anything else that you want to talk about in terms of legacy burden development, how they're passed down? Is there anything we didn't touch in that arena?
And maybe this is where someone who's like has a lot more experience in that area might be able to talk more about how that's passed down, because I think there's a lot of different ways
Yeah.
that legacy burdens can, come into um, our system. And um, yeah, I don't know if there's too much more I wanna say about, like, how they actually come in. And in terms of, how we work with legacy burdens, I think this is something that is still developing. I mean, there is a protocol, like I mentioned, Ann Cinco, it's very well in the IFS community, has developed a protocol, Kay Gardner as well too, and some of this work too has also been influenced by, some folks are bringing in some work of Daniel Four, who's done ancestral healing, and Tamala Floyd too, who's bringing in some other aspects of legacy unburdenings and a more communal aspect of that. So, part of the legacy unburdening is just kind of getting a sense how much of this is a legacy burden, how much is yours, and how much doesn't belong to you. And something I found really helpful for myself and when working with others is just, and I can't remember who said this in the IFS community, but it's kind of like a pie chart. If you're envisioning a pie, like what slice is yours without thinking about it? Just, what do you get immediately? What slice feels like it's yours? And usually folks will say, like 25% is mine or whatever it is, like they get a number. They get a vision in their mind, like, yeah, this is my piece of it, but a lot of it's not mine.
Sure. Yeah, that having someone envision that pie and okay, what percentage is something that is mine from my experience versus what percentage was passed down to me.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a piece of it. And another thing that, I think this can vary too, but the general thinking is that if you notice a legacy burden, that it might be helpful to unburden that first, because it's not something part of a person's direct experience, and then work with that piece that is their lived experience. Because that's sometimes how we know a legacy burden is present, is someone's worked with an issue for a while and it's like it keeps coming back. Like I keep working with this. I feel like I've unburdened this like so many times and I'm not noticing a shift. And sometimes that can be an indication that there's something more, that
Okay.
there's something else that's there, and it's not just something in that person's lived experience.
Sure. So they've gone through this healing process, this unburdening with that inner child, that exiled part, maybe a couple times, multiple times, and it's still just sticking. And so that's something that would kind of perk your, well, maybe we need to look into this being legacy, what percentage of this is yours. And yeah, that, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And then a lot of it is kind of, I mean, in some ways similar to the IFS unburdening process where, you work with parts or exiles or protectors to release those burdens. So checking in if there's concerns, of releasing the burden. And with legacy work, it can be a little different because oftentimes, you know, there'll be fears like around like loss of connection, to your ancestors, or somehow being disloyal, to your family, to your ancestors. So those are really important things to consider and to check on, and just seeing if any parts, because it may not be like maybe the person says like, oh gosh, yeah, it'd be so great to be rid of this, but it's good to check and say, does any part of them have any concerns or worries, or is hesitant, to release this. And oftentimes you'll notice something along those lines coming up of like, well, what will happen to my ancestors? Like, am I, going to be doing something disloyal? Am I not going to be connected,
Yeah.
anymore? So those are real important things to kind of to cover before, proceeding into an unburdening.
Yeah. So seeing if there's any other parts that have concerns, fears about unburdening, releasing what that person is holding on to that's been passed down from their,
Mm.
because I mean that makes sense. That this seems like a rational concern to be worried about losing connection with those who came before, or that you're dishonoring them in some way, betraying that. And so in that space, you're kind of validating that part of them, like inviting them to kind of validate that part that has concerns, and gain permission before you step into the unburdening process.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And also too, part of the work is inviting in, you know, ancestors known and unknown, who may be carrying this burden, after checking in with the concerns. And and this is where it can be a little different depending on, the person's belief system, their culture, their community, is whether or not they want to invite in any well ancestors to assist with this unburdening. And I think this, to me, feels really important, in a way that, even thinking about just like individual work versus group work, and it's like a Western view of, what some people view it as like a Western view of doing therapy or IFS work, in this linear way. And then other people saying, it feels more communal, like it, a little bit more spacious to have this circle, of ancestors that may be coming in and witnessing and holding and helping with this unburdening, that we don't have to do it all ourselves. The the work doesn't just have to be in me, because this can feel really big
Yeah.
for people systems, depending on what the legacy burden is, what the history is there. So having ancestral support, for some people, is just essential.
Yeah. And so that's something you would invite the person to do once you get permission from the protectors to kind of go through the unburdening process. You invite them to uh, invite an ancestor who can. You said a well ancestor
Well,
who,
ancestor.
yeah,
And that comes from sort of some of Daniel Four's ancestral healing work. So, kind of going up the line to an ancestor that is well, like before this burden was taken
ah,
on, to assist with
wow,
releasing that burden. And I mean, I know for myself, like, it's not an ancestor that I have known in my life. Like, it's going way, way far back. So,
yeah,
yeah, I know some of this parts are like, this can start to go into like really woo-woo territory. People are like, whoa, that's way out there, you know. And I totally get that. I have a lot of parts that were skeptical, I think, after my experience, like, did that just happen?
yeah,
Like, really trying to understand it. And some parts of me really can't on a rational level, but
yeah.
it's more felt experience, of, this is what I experienced, and I can't deny that, but it's kind of hard to understand with my rational mind. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I know you're not alone with having that rational mind thinking part for me too. And I think I've even heard someone talk about Dick Schwartz kind of not talking about this phenomena too much as he initially was relaying his work to the public, that this idea of legacy burden or connecting with an ancestor who one, a well ancestor who one doesn't even know. Like, my understanding is he had experiences with people, where people would experience these guides, these ancestors coming into the sessions as they did their work. And he too kind of had that, okay, are we getting into the woo-woos? But it seems like a phenomena that is consistent with people. And it seems like we are. I forget where I heard it, but I think I heard that there's research on epigenetics that's
Mhm.
been published that kind of is supporting this idea that in people groups that have experienced multi-generational trauma, even if that younger person hasn't experienced that trauma, they still have similar stress levels as their parent. Although their parent experienced trauma, they didn't, but they still are whole. So whether that's passed down in genetics or from their caregiver. It, I mean, it seems like there's some definitely truth here in this phenomena.
Yeah, I agree. I don't remember the study, but I think it was Bob Falconer who shared this with me, and I wish I could recall the study, but there was something done with parts of me that hate studies that are done on animals. But it was using mice and something about they took some mice and I think they shocked them whenever they, smelled, I think it was cherry blossom scent or something like that, and then kept the offspring like separate. Like so I don't remember
Oh,
the males and then they mated and then the offspring were so they kept them all separate so the offspring weren't even influenced by the parents like they didn't have any they were I don't know if they were
wow.
raised by different mice or it was like two generations down so there was no
Nope.
interaction and the smell of cherry blossoms would activate these mice that
Wow.
were like one or two generations away had no experience so it wasn't even like the parenting of the parent mice, affecting their children. It wasn't even that at all, like it
Wow.
complete, that study, really was pretty important in terms of saying, like, yeah, there are like these things are carried
Yeah.
um, on, even if you don't have any direct experience, and even with the interactions with a parent.
Yeah. Well, that certainly makes sense, and yeah, I'd be interested in talking more about that unburdening process. I don't think I've had too many conversations on this podcast about like how what unburdening looks like, and maybe we can get into some specifics about the legacy unburdening process.
Sure. So, in a typical or I don't want to say typical, but like in the way it's taught in IFS and doing an unburdening, oftentimes there's suggestions made to release the burden to one of the elements like air or fire or water or the earth. I'm very open. I'm just like, what feels right for you? Some people have, put it into. I remember there's one person who said this went into this like cup of hot chocolate and she stirred it around and it like a marshmallow, it like just melted into the hot chocolate or swirls. I mean, just whatever feels right, I think,
Yeah.
for releasing the burden. And the same goes for, I think, legacy unburdenings as well, too. Like, as is with most things in IFS, it's really tracking the client and and his or her their system and seeing what feels right. And when you get to this point when you're doing an unburdening, there's usually so much self energy in the client system in the in the room that it just unfolds in the way that it needs to. So oftentimes I'll just ask like, okay, so you have this burden, so what needs to happen? And really inviting the client's ancestors to let us know how does that need to happen, and where I feel my role is in just checking to see if there's any residue, if that feels complete, and then at the end, whenever that feels complete, also checking to see if there's any gifts or heirlooms that, the ancestors would like to, bring forward for the client, like things that may have been pushed out, or anything that, they wanna share, like because a lot of focus is on the burdens, but there's also these beautiful gifts that are passed down from our ancestors that we may not be aware of. And so it could be really just such a beautiful process to go full circle like that.
Oh, that's nice. And so you're inviting the client to really take the lead, and as they're connecting with one of these well ancestors, perhaps like what you're checking in, what needs to happen now throughout this process, and then going through and unburdening what does that tend to look like? What can it look like with maybe an example with
Sure.
these legacy burdens?
Sure. So I'll just speak about my own experiences as an example. I kind of felt this thing kind of rolling back. So mine wasn't so much where there were people standing around or ancestors in a circle, but it was like this passing back of the burden, that was going into, like, a big net is what it looked like a giant, like, silver, like, white net, and all of it was just, like, going back into it and, like, filling this thing up, like, and just, and then it kind of went off into the ether, but it kind of took a while for it to come totally out of my system. So that's one of the reasons I check on, like if there's any residue, like, from the bottom, the soles of your feet, is anything in your back, just noticing if there's any places where, or any parts that may be reluctant to, release. And some of
Sure.
that goes to the concerns, but occasionally parts will come up like, oh, I'm not sure, and just checking to see, are there any, anything still connected, any little, strings or tendrils or anything still connected to you anywhere. An indication if there's any parts that may still, be reluctant to release. And so doing that checking can be really helpful. But that's how it was with mine. I know for some folks I've heard, it's like going into this, into the fire in the middle. It's like all the, this
Ah,
thing, and then there's like almost like a bonfire in
okay.
the middle, and it's just getting dumped into this fire, which is just burning. And
Ah,
so that's, another experience I've heard of with a legacy unburdening. But there's, so many ways I think it can happen. It's really what feels right for the client
sure.
and his or her their ancestors.
Yeah, and hearing that's kind of your focus is what following that person's lead. And I know Dick talks about that, and I think that's a beautiful part of the model is there seems to be these patterns for unburdening, and at the same time we really want to support people in unburdening as it makes sense to them and in any part of their system that has wisdom around that.
Yeah, there's so much wisdom. There's so much wisdom in the client system, in the client's ancestors, and usually it's like so much more than I could have ever come up with. I mean, and I really appreciate that in doing this work that I don't have to come up with it. I mean, I definitely can offer things, but more often than not, it just unfolds in a way that's just more amazing than I could have ever imagined.
Yeah. It's ironic, isn't it, when we kind of let go of that control of how we want things to unfold. They often, unfold a lot better than I mean they yeah, always do, I think in the context of a healing relationship. Yeah, that's good. And yeah, I love that continuing to check in if there's any residue and then yeah, so your experience it was this passing back
Hmm.
um, to your ancestors that burden other people's experience you've heard it's like a circle around a fire like releasing the burdens into the fire
Yeah.
and checking
Yeah.
the body like is there any residual burden that's not being let go any other parts that have concerns.
Yeah, because that can be one way that these burdens aren't fully released, is if there's any, part of a person that's not ready or not wanting to let go. And so, sometimes there's a little pause in the work to really check in, address those concerns, and then complete the unburdening. But it's really important, I think, to just take the time that it needs, to be able to hold space for all of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely to me feels like something it just can't be rushed.
Yeah.
It kind of unfold, and it
Mm.
sometimes feels like it can take a little while
Yeah.
because yeah, there's a history there. There's a lot. It feels weighty. And so just like with any unburdening work, it's something we want to have enough time for. So, like, if we only have 15 minutes left in a session, and I'm like, well, I wonder if that's a legacy burden, wouldn't start, working with a legacy burden at that point. Like, really want to be able to have the time to spend.
Sure.
Because it not always, but it can take a little bit of time.
So you'd want a good 30, 40, maybe even 50 minutes to go through this process. Or yeah, you wouldn't want to start it towards the end of a session.
Yeah,
Yeah.
ideally. Yeah,
Yeah.
I wouldn't start it, if you don't have a lot of time left in the session, because, yeah, just and also too, to really be able to integrate and allow space for, those gifts that are coming in.
Yeah.
And then really feeling that, being able to take the time to, take that in.
Yeah.
Um and maybe process a little bit
Yeah.
afterwards, because sometimes this can be, um, really new or feel really strange, for some parts of a person's system. Like, what just happened? Like, that's something that I've never experienced before.
Sure. Creating that space to process what happened, and then I was hearing going slow too, and that's, I know there's parts of me that just want to be efficient and quickly go from one thing to the next, and it's such a nice message for me of that slowing things down. That's been true for me in the training, is like just slowing down, what's happening here, what's coming up in the body, spending, like you were talking about earlier, spending time with the protective parts. That's really nice. I was curious if you'd be comfortable sharing. You talked about gifts sometimes that the ancestors will give to us. Did you receive any when you went through your legacy unburdening?
Yeah. It wasn't something that was really focused on too much, because we were in a practice group. So
Oh,
it was this
yeah.
was not meant to be a legacy unburdening session. It was really unexpected. Um, but in and I do really appreciate that I was able to have some time to journal about it afterwards. So the PA, gave me a little space to kind of write and jot that down. So it wasn't part of the work that we did in the practice group, but as I was reflecting and journaling, like, I was realizing, like, this resilience, I mean, it almost kind of turned it on its head. It's like this core strength, that I feel, and this resilience, like, that's the gift, that I really appreciate. And it doesn't have to come with, that energy of,
Yeah.
like, it doesn't have to
Yeah.
have real strong inner critic to go along with it. Like, the harshness of that wasn't necessary in order to have the strength. Like, they were kind of paired together. That was the burden. It was like that in order to be strong, you must have this other piece of it. It's gotta be sort of this harsh sort of strong, but that got uncoupled in that
Ah,
process. And,
wow.
really recognizing the gift that was passed down.
Wow. So you were able to kind of untangle that the harshness, the critical part that had been kind of connected with that core strength and resilience, and kind of let that part go and hold on to the strength and resilience and that you connected with what your ancestors passed down. Wow,
Yeah. Uh,
that's powerful.
yeah, I mean, I'm just so grateful. Like, it was such a gift for me, and, being so early in my IFS journey, I didn't realize it's not what we do in a level 1 training. We don't do legacy
Yeah.
unburdening. I was like, "Oh, wow, that was really wild." I, didn't realize it was kind of unusual, but I think it's becoming more well known, as you were saying. Like, it wasn't talked about as much, but I think it's becoming more in the mainstream.
Yeah. Well, that's good, and I think this conversation will help bring this concept to more people's ears, both therapists and people who are going through therapy, and so that'll be really helpful. And we're getting about to the end of the interview here, and before I ask you the last question, I generally ask guests, could you, if people are interested in getting in touch with you, share your contact information, maybe a website, email, whatever you're comfortable sharing?
Yeah, I was thinking about that before we came on. I'm still working on the website. This is like
Okay.
one of the things that eventually will get up and running,
Yeah.
but my email is Kristen, Kristen .Burge, Burge at arrowcreekwellness.com.
Perfect.
So we have the website. It's just not live yet. So
Yeah.
it should be hopefully soon.
Great. And send it my way once it goes live, and I'll be able to get it in the show notes, and I'll have your email in the show notes if people want to reach out. And the last question I generally ask guests is, what's a message of hope you want to leave the listener with today?
I love that question. Parts of me really resonate with that. I guess the message of hope that I'm noticing and feeling is that regardless what happens in the external world, we can always be there for ourselves and for our parts, that they are never alone. And that to me has been a source of hope and comfort. Even when life can throw these major curveballs our way, that's always available to us.
Wow. Well, that's a powerful message and a powerful place to end the interview. Kristen, thanks so much for being on the podcast today.
Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah. Please press the subscribe button, as well as rating and reviewing our podcast. This helps others connect with what you've been hearing. If you have any questions, please contact us at themindofatherapist@gmail.com. These questions will be kept anonymous. I want to thank Eric Price for the wonderful music you hear in this podcast. Additionally, this podcast was created to provide accurate and authoritative information on the subject matter. Although we are interviewing licensed therapists, they are not your therapists. This podcast is not intended to serve as direct medical advice and should not be used as a substitute for direct professional help. It is given with understanding that neither the host, publisher, guests, or PCS are rendering legal, clinical, or other professional information. If you need a professional, we encourage you to find one. Visit Psychology Today to connect with a licensed clinician near you.